everyone, Mikki here. You're listening to Wikipedia. This week on the podcast, I speak to Tamzyn Murphy. Tamzyn is a registered dietitian, and we chat all about her Ketovore approach. Haven't heard of it? Well, you're going to love this podcast. Tamzyn discusses her professional background and how this, combined with her personal health journey, led her to a carnivore diet, and the benefits she has gained from this, and how her experience helped her uncover more research and be able to help her clients. We discuss the many misconceptions around an animal-forward diet and its impact on health, and also some of the common side effects people might experience when adopting it and how to overcome these. We also discuss who might benefit from trying this animal-forward or Ketovore approach, and how you can find more information. So Tamzyn is a registered dietitian, science writer, editor, and nutrition educator with a special interest and expertise in ketogenic diets and therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, particularly in relation to mental and gut health. She holds a master's degree in physiology, where her research focused on TCR, Therapeutic Carbohydrate Restriction, in type 2 diabetes under the supervision of Professor Tim Noakes. Currently, she serves as the Senior Editorial Manager, Content Editor and Creator, and Contributing Lecturer at Nutrition Network, the global leader in TCR training for healthcare professionals. As a science writer, author, and editor, she has contributed to various publications, most recently to the textbook Ketogenic, The Science of Therapeutic Carbohydrate Restriction in Human Health, and she also has co-authored, contributed to, and edited several books, including Sugar Free and Eat Right Revolution, and has written for health magazines and peer-reviewed publications on nutrition and TCR. She's passionate about improving health and quality of life, particularly in her home country of South Africa, and serves on the board of directors for Eat Better South Africa, a community-based outreach program focused on implementing nutritional education in lower socioeconomic communities. Her experience also includes work in nutritional supplements, as well as clinical experience in private dietetics practice and community interventions centered on TCR. And you can hear from our conversation that Tamzyn is just so knowledgeable, and we really only scratched the surface of that knowledge. And I'm really hoping I can chat to Tamzyn again on the podcast and dive a little deeper into this area for you. Before we crack on into the interview though, I'd like to remind you that the best way to support the podcast is to hit the subscribe button on your favourite podcast listening platform, because that increases the visibility in amongst literally thousands of other podcasts out there. So more people get the experience of listening to people like Tamzyn and get to hear their expertise. Alright team, I've popped links to where you can find out more about Tamzyn and Nutrition Network in the show notes, but for now, enjoy this conversation I've had with Tamzyn Murphy. To have the opportunity to, I mean, that's where we connect, right? So
exactly.
So we'll have to work at that. Yeah. So Tamzyn, I'm really interested to understand more of your backstory, actually, because it is rare to find, well, maybe it's not so rare now, but particularly when we started out, it was really rare to have a dietitian interested in a low-carb approach. And so can we just start there really by you giving us a little bit of your background with your dietetic study, and of course I know that you did your master's looking at LCHF. So what encouraged that from a professional perspective for you?
Well, that's a very good question. So I was traditionally trained as a dietitian, where we followed the normal dietary guidelines, where you make grains and starchy foods the basis of every meal, with a very heavy emphasis on fruit and veggies and some legumes, and you limit fat, especially saturated fat. And at least we're all kind of in agreement that you should limit sugar. So at least there's that. But then also the concern around red meat, saturated fat, cholesterol. I mean, that's how I was trained. And so I went out into the working world I live in South Africa. And in South Africa, when you become any kind of healthcare professional, you need to go do a year of community service in the community. So I went out into the lower income communities, and I did my year of community service, and I pushed the same message in the clinics and in the day facilities and that, and amongst impoverished people who are struggling with insulin resistant conditions, huge obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all of that we're seeing worldwide was no less prevalent, if not more prevalent, in the impoverished communities where I did my community service year. And then I actually wanted to carry on working in that scenario, but I didn't end up working out, and I moved into the supplement industry because I always had a strong interest in the biochemical underpinnings of kind of nutrients in the body. What do they do? What's happening on a metabolic kind of level? I was never interested in cooking or the kind of out of the body experience with nutrients. I was always interested in the in-body experience with nutrients. What happens once they hit your body, once they hit your blood, and what are the processes behind that? So supplements it's a fun industry in that you're isolating individual nutrients, and then you can go onto Google Scholar or PubMed and into the peer-reviewed journals and research what these nutrients do in isolation, and then start research and development for supplement products. And then I was involved in the research and development, the training of the reps in that area, and the writing of like infographics and things like that, which was really scratched my itch for my love of biochemistry. And then I got involved simultaneously with one of the leading health magazines in South Africa, which has since closed down. But its name was Health Intelligence Magazine, and I became a writer for Health Intelligence, and then I became the nutrition editor for the magazine, where I also took on the role of ensuring that everything within that magazine was science-based. And I trained all the journalists that work for the magazine in how to assess the articles in front of them, how to reference properly, how to back up what they're saying in a scientific manner, that actually they weren't just saying sweeping statements, all that kind of thing, and which I really enjoyed. And it was during that time, by then it must have been around 2013, 2012, maybe even. And I stumbled across, well, actually in South Africa, Prof. Tim Noakes was rising to the forefront with his new claims that a low carbohydrate Atkins-esque, that he called Banting diet, cured his diabetes and was the solution to insulin resistance and diabetes and the metabolic diseases that plague mankind. So he came up with this, and all the dietitians and traditional people, including myself, were up in arms. How can he be promoting this fad diet? He's this A1 rated scientist with the Medical Research Council behind him. He's got amazing acclaim, huge numbers of citations and peer-reviewed journals and articles behind him. How can he be talking about a fad diet? This is insane. And so I decided I wanted to go to a talk by him just to kind of see what this crazy person was saying. And in the meanwhile, I continued to now start to write and edit articles for this magazine on the topic of paleo and low carb diets, which had now hit the media and were really of great interest in South Africa and I think worldwide as well. And as I started researching and reference checking these articles, I started to see that actually there was more scientific evidence to back this kind of diet up than I had thought. I started looking at paleo and seeing how, what was thinking about evolutionarily consistent diets. What are humans as a species supposed to be eating? Thinking of those kind of things. Also, looking at, I read Torbs's book, Good Calories, Bad Calories at the time.
Yes.
And I started also reading Lustig's stuff about sugar, and I started getting an idea of what was actually going on. And it was all kind of supporting Noakes. And then the supplement company that I worked for launched an advert for our new stevia product, claiming all sorts of terrible things about sugar. So in this advert, we said, eating too much sugar causes diabetes, increases your risk of cancer, makes you get fat, all these kind of claims. And the South African Sugar Association didn't like it. So they took our company, the supplement company that was making stevia, that had this advert, they took them to the Advertising Standards Authority. complaining about this advert, saying it's not true that sugar does all these things. So my company at the time said, well, why don't you go to see Noakes talk at a local university where he was coming to talk, and you can get the time off work, but you need to go talk to him afterwards and see if he'll be an expert witness against the Sugar Association. So I did that. I went to his talk and I went to speak to him afterwards, and I said, here's the complaint. Would you be interested in being an expert witness? Because no one wants to stand against the Sugar Association. And he said, well, if it's against the Sugar Association, he'll be an expert witness. But he wants to write it in collaboration with me because he doesn't have too much time on his hands. So I started collaborating with Prof. Tim Noakes on basically a naysaying expert deposition against the Sugar Association in support of the statements that were made in the advert. Now, at this time, you must understand that I had been researching a lot into this diet and finding that actually it wasn't a fad diet at all. It potentially was the way people were eating before we started getting the chronic diseases of lifestyle that we're all plagued with, before we started seeing the obesity epidemic. I think the first heart attack was only recorded in the early 1900s, like 1902 or something like that, if I remember correctly. So it's in those first few years of the turn of the century, we didn't know what heart attacks were before then. They were so rare that they hadn't even been documented before. So something was happening. And then obviously all of this started to really rise to pandemic proportions in the late 70s, early 80s, and since then. We can talk about that, but I don't think that's the topic of this. So basically, that's where I started. It was the research for the magazine, and then it was the collaboration with Prof. Noakes. And then he said, well, would I like to come and study further with him? And by then the bug had bitten, and I'd realized that there was something big here. And so that's why I ended up doing my master's degree in low carbohydrate nutrition and type 2 diabetes, where we did a pilot study of 30 participants who had already put their own type 2 diabetes into remission following Noakes' advice, following a low carb diet. And so we documented these cases. We took their blood reports from before they were diagnosed with diabetes, at the point when they were diagnosed with diabetes, and then because we have labs that we could access the results for, and then at the time that we saw them after they were in remission. And and we found that 75% of them were in true remission as defined as normal blood glucose and HbA1c levels without any medication apart from metformin, which most people did stay on. Yeah, so no insulin, no sulfonylureas, nothing like that. So that's where I went, and from there I started working for the Nutrition Network, which is an online training platform where we teach doctors, dietitians, nutritionists, coaches, psychologists, nurses, and even the lay people about therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, which is what a low carb diet is called when it's used to treat conditions for therapeutic purposes. Yeah. So we train on that, and it's really wonderful because I get a chance to carry on my research and to continue to learn, continue to grow, and to share the message with clinicians, coaches, and the layperson. And so that was my professional journey. Yeah, my personal journey is a separate one.
Yes. Now talk to me about this, because obviously, as you're learning, the information is coming to light, which is new to you, about the impact that diet has on our health, and how the information we were taught didn't necessarily reflect actually what we now understand to be sort of a healthy diet. Like, how did your own eating change across that journey, Tamzyn?
So I've definitely been through phases. So I started out, a bit more paleo and moved on to low carb. So I went low carb because I thought, well, this is clearly, it's got evidence. So as I went through the evidence and I convinced myself that this was a better way for humans to eat to avoid all these diseases that we are getting, I moved into basically a low carb space where I was avoiding grains. I was avoiding ultra processed foods and added sugars. But initially I first still included fruit and starchy veg and dairy. So not fully paleo then, I suppose. But because of my gut, which I will get into, I also avoided legumes, and then things like, well, mainly legumes and cabbage would be the big ones I avoided because I knew that my gut didn't tolerate those very well. But at that stage, I was even actually including a little bit of oats, like maybe half a cup of oats, thinking, well, that's 15 grams of carbs. I can still stick to kind of below 130 grams of carbs, which is lowish carbs, right? And I wasn't aiming for keto. And then as I got more into the space, I moved into a more ketogenic diet where I excluded fruit, I excluded starchy vegetables, I definitely excluded the oats and all the grains, and still the processed foods and all that. And I went through, and then I avoided milk as much as possible, except for maybe 20 mils maybe in a cup of tea. But that was it. So I avoided milk because of its high carb content, but never avoided cream or a little small portion of double cream yogurt or cheese or butter. So probably the highest carbs amongst those dairy categories would have been the yogurt. So that's kind of how I ate. But I found that I was still eating plenty of vegetables, right? So I was having an omelet in the morning with lots of fat. I wasn't scared of saturated fat anymore. So plenty of butter, rendered animal fat, all that kind of thing. But I would stuff that omelet filled with spinach and tomato and mushrooms and, all sorts of veggies, maybe leftover veggies from the night before. And then for lunch, I might have a tuna mayo salad because I wasn't avoiding seed oils either in the early stages. I was still having mayonnaise.
Did Noakes not avoid seed oil? Or did
so he
or
did.
You,
he did, but I didn't understand why. He was all about no carbs, no carbs, no carbs. And I was okay, that's fine. I understand that from an insulin perspective. Because the most simplistic way of understanding it that I had initially was carbs increase insulin. Yeah. Insulin puts your body into one, fat storage mode. So you're going to get fat, and shuts down fat breakdown mode or lipolysis. So you can't break down fat, you're storing fat. And that goes with Torb's, which I'd read in the beginning, goes with his energy distribution thing where all of your energy is locked up in the fat stores and you can't access them. So you need to continue to eat even though you're storing fat, because now you have all of your fuel is in lockdown mode. Where are you going to get fuel? You have to keep eating to get the fuel to fuel your cells, right? So I was like, okay, that makes sense. Insulin is the fat storage hormone, but it also, in high amounts in response to chronically high carb intake, it's going to continue to knock on those insulin receptor doors and continue to force the skeletal muscle and other cells to take up glucose continuously when they get saturated with glucose. And I was like, okay, they're getting saturated with glucose. That glucose gets converted into nasty lipid intermediates, and I was thinking, okay, that's not good for insulin sensitivity. Insulin resistance starts developing, and then you're moving towards diabetes and all the insulin resistant conditions. So I'm like, okay, fat storage problem, moving towards insulin resistant conditions. I don't want carbs. Noakes said, well, we should also avoid seed oils, processed seed oils. Okay. But then at the time, Eric Westman was still happy for his patients to be eating mayonnaises and seed oils, and happy for them to eat processed meats. And they were still losing weight and the diabetes was still resolving. So I was like, well, yeah, sure, but what's wrong with polyunsaturated fatty acids? Even omega-6s are essential. Surely, like how bad can it possibly be? Carbs are the villain.
Yeah.
That was my thinking at the time. Now, don't quote me on this because it's not my thinking anymore, but that was my thinking at the time. So I'd have a tuna mayo salad, with lots of salady, green salady things. And then at dinner, I might have stir fry or something like that with maybe a bit of chicken. So that kind of thing. I was eating like that, but I was diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome when I was 20. My gut was perfect before that. Before the age of 19, I had no gut problems. At 19, I started to develop gut problems, which were then, there were scopes and all sorts of things, and I was diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome. Irritable bowel syndrome is the gut disorder that plagues humanity the most of all gut disorders. 1 in 4 people have it. So I'm not really in much of a minority here. Many of the people, your listeners, will also have irritable bowel syndrome. What is it? It's one of my worst diagnoses because it is an idiopathic condition. Idiopathic is a big fancy word that clinicians and doctors use to say we don't know what the hell this is. And they put it into the I don't know what this is box, and they call it idiopathic. So it sounds like they know what's going on with you. But if you have idiopathic constipation, it means you have constipation, we don't know what's causing it. If you have irritable bowel syndrome, you have an irritated bowel, and we don't know why, right? I mean, anything that's idiopathic, yeah.
Did anything occur, like stress-wise, for you at that age that contributed to the IBS? Is that where
so stress is something I wanted to talk about. So that's interesting, yeah. So I think there were two things that happened at that age. At the age of 19, it was my first year university, and I moved out of home and I went to live in res. And I became vegetarian, and I got very sick. I spent most of that year being very sick. And when I was very sick, I went on multiple courses of antibiotics. So I moved out of home. I became vegetarian. I became iron deficient, so that my gums were purple, my skin was pale, and I had to sleep for 3 hours every afternoon. It was terrible. I wasn't getting enough iron in, and I also started to get really fat. I gained 6 kilos, which for me was a lot, and I was well above any weight I've been before or since. So it was, what they call first year spread, I suppose. I was drinking a lot of alcohol. I wasn't eating any meat, and my vegetarian food, I had no clue about nutrition. So I wasn't trying to balance any amino acids or complement foods or anything like that. I was just eating what they gave me at res in the dining hall. I was drinking excessive amounts of alcohol on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturday nights. And I was anemic and exhausted. And then I started to get this chronic cough that wouldn't go away. I was also living in a very, very old building, which I think had a mold problem as well. And I was living in an area of South Africa that is renowned for its bad water quality. So did mold contribute to it from the building? Did the bad water quality, I didn't even boil the water. I should have boiled it before drinking it or filtered it, but I didn't. Did that contribute to it? My iron, we know iron is a very important immunological agent. If you don't have enough iron, you get sick. It's there, for partially for that reason. And was I immunologically impaired? Yes. So, and then I went and took antibiotic upon antibiotic upon antibiotic, multiple courses, messing up my gut flora. So I was even further predisposed. Basically, I was a castle with all my drawbridges down, waiting to be infiltrated by, all sorts of pathogens. And that happened. And then by the third quarter of the year, I ended up starting to get this diarrhea out of nowhere. And I was like, why? I'm not even sick per se. But I would get diarrhea. And then it started to get particularly bad around stressful times. So my diarrhea would be worse, like when I'm going into the exam room kind of thing. I have to come in late because I have to run to the loo kind of thing. So this is very typical of people with IBS. But where did the IBS start? I believe it was less stress, because at that stage I wasn't actually doing a very stressful degree my first year. It was quite a chilled year, actually, from an academic stress perspective. I was having lots of fun, but I was sick. I was iron deficient anemic. I was totally not getting a nutritionally sufficient diet at all. Being vegetarian, but not even a well-formulated vegetarian. And I was drinking excessive amounts of alcohol. I was not exercising. So I was living an unhealthy lifestyle, and I messed up my gut with the antibiotics as well. It was it's not even surprising in hindsight.
No, it's like a perfect storm.
Perfect storm. Exactly. So then, I don't know where I was with this, but I came home the next year to my part of the world, because this was upcountry. So, and I started doing university closer to home, and I stopped being vegetarian because no matter how many iron supplements I took, I couldn't, even the best quality ones with vitamin C, I could not resolve my iron deficiency anemia. So I had to start eating steaks. So I did, and my iron deficiency anemia went away. I also stopped drinking so much, and I went for these scopes because my IBS didn't get better. And that's when the doctor found, oh, you've got IBS because we can't see anything structurally wrong, which is how they decide to diagnose you with IBS. They do scopes up your bum, they do scopes down your throat, they do all sorts of tests, they do blood tests to check you haven't got celiac disease, which is the true kind of gluten sensitivity, but it's actually an allergic reaction to gluten. They do all these tests, and if they can't find anything structurally or wrong with you in your blood, they will diagnose you with IBS. So that's what I was diagnosed with at that stage, at the age of 20.
And then, Tamzyn, your shift into a low carb and then ketogenic diet, did that help resolve some of your issues?
Yes. So when I went keto, I definitely found that I was IBS kind of mixed type, which means I would swing from being constipated for weeks to suddenly being in the other direction, having diarrhea for a week or whatever, and then swinging again. So I definitely found that my energy levels went up. So remember, by the age of 20, I wasn't vegetarian anymore, and I wasn't drinking too much anymore. But on keto, which happened many years later, my gut started to swing less in one direction. It seemed to be more stable, more resilient. But I almost never got the diarrhea anymore. But then the gastroenterologist said, well, now you have swung into the constipation predominant IBS category. And I had such bloat that I would sometimes look like I was, a few months pregnant due to the amount of bloat, and it was painful, really painful. So that was still happening. And, it's not only painful, but it's socially inappropriate to have a huge amount of gas as well. So, uncomfortable, painful, you look terrible, you feel sluggish. And it was only when I then started to reduce my vegetables that part started to resolve. So I definitely had an improvement with keto, with plenty of vegetables. I had an improvement. I didn't get the diarrhea anymore, and I got more energy levels. I got high energy levels. I had absolutely no sign of anemia, and I felt pretty good, but I was very bloated and painful often. So, and then that's when I moved on to a different form of keto, which is more the Ketovore. And I can tell you that journey as well, but that seemed to resolve my gut issues almost completely. And I can also tell you that my IBS got worse before it got better. I was then diagnosed with an inflammatory bowel disease because I ended up in hospital twice, bleeding, passed out, having to be carried to hospital because I had ulcers in my gut. Yeah, so it ended up being, okay, well, maybe you're not IBS, maybe you actually have ulcerative colitis, which is an inflammatory bowel disease. Since then, the gastroenterologist, because I've sought so many doctors' opinions, specialist opinions on this, and since then, the consensus seems to think, well, actually, it was never ulcerative colitis, it was always really bad IBS, but you did get ulcers, and that was likely due to a combination of stress and a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication and an infection, a gastrointestinal infection, which was then, so it looks like that actually was the cause of that. Whereas I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis by the surgeon who did the scope and when I was in hospital, but it turns out that it wasn't that. It was actually IBS, but I also got a gastrointestinal infection, which then I treated with loperamide, which stops you from going to the loo. So then the bacteria just built up a nice little city and colony inside my gut where they started eating away at my intestines, combined with the fact that I was treating myself with ibuprofen, which is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, which can cause ulcers alone by itself. And it was, again, a perfect storm I created for myself that ended me up passed out in a pool of blood.
Oh, but goodness.
But it luckily it turned out that wasn't. I clearly am predisposed to that because I've gut issues, right? So I think I'm predisposed to ulcers. And I do want to say, because IBS falls into the I don't know what's wrong with you box, I think everyone should be careful because it means you're predisposed to all the other things. Then your gut is not healthy. Even though they can't tell you what's not healthy about it, it's not healthy. And you've got bacterial imbalance called dysbiosis. Some people with IBS, a lot of people with IBS will have a specific bacterial imbalance called small bowel bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, or small bowel, intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And, whatever you have, you probably have a mess up of the guts in your, the bugs in your gut. And then and you probably have leaky gut as well. The tight junctions between your cells, the cell lining in your gut, the epithelial cells, they are probably the kind of cement that holds them together is probably not doing a great job. And you're starting to have a permeable gut, a bit like you can imagine if you stick your hand into a lady's stocking leg and you see the little holes in the stocking open up, is a bit like that. So you're ending up with a lot of bigger molecules that shouldn't be going into your blood. So you're predisposed to all sorts of things as soon as you have a condition like IBS. And for me, I was catapulted into ulcers and that kind of thing. But I wanted to talk about the fiber. I reduced the fiber in the form of vegetables when I started
Ketovore.
Yes, Ketovore.
Yes, because so it's rare that a dietitian will make this move. And so what I'm curious to know is, like, in your head, like when you thought, maybe I need to reduce the fiber in my diet to help support my gut, when you already had removed so many other things, is any part of your brain like, the fiber is really important for me, just because it's really hard to unlearn information. Yeah. I've realized, because I did the similar training to you. And so it's very difficult to unlearn that training. So did you have any sort of brain resistance there?
So much. But it was a gradual process, Mikki. It was a really gradual process, all of this. So because I was so interested in gut stuff, because of my own gut, I stumbled across this paper, which I was actually writing an article back already when the magazine was still running. So this was like end of 2010-ish, probably. No, it must have been after that, because the paper came out in 2012. But the paper's entitled, in 2012, Stopping or Reducing Dietary Fiber Intake Reduces Constipation and its Associated Symptoms. And I remember I wrote an article on this idea because it became a headline study that actually stopping fiber might help. Now, up until this point, I had been supplementing with fiber, psyllium husk, which many IBS patients do, right? I'd been supplementing with fiber, eating plenty of vegetables that were high in fiber, as much fiber as possible. And here it said that adding more fiber to your diet, especially in cases of idiopathic constipation, in other words, constipation of unknown cause, is like adding cars to a traffic jam. And I have never forgotten that statement. Because what happens when you add more cars to a traffic jam? Does the traffic ease up? No, the traffic gets worse. But do more cars come out on the other end of the highway? Probably. I mean, there's a lot of cars. Now there's so many more cars. They're moving through more slowly, but when they come out the other end, there's a lot of cars, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, if you add a lot of fiber in people, especially people who are predisposed, I'm not saying that this is the case for everyone, but absolutely in cases of idiopathic constipation. And I found it with my clients time and time again. If we reduce or cut dietary fiber dramatically, and I'm not talking just the insoluble or the soluble. If you cut them, both of them, you find that often the constipation resolves and the bloating and the gas resolves and the pain that's associated with it resolves. Yes, you might not have your stools, which eventually get passed, won't necessarily be as big, won't be as many cars because you haven't added all this bulk to them. But you find that you need to go less often because there's less cars, and you have less discomfort and less bloating, less pain. So I definitely find that is the case. So this led me to the whole going down the fiber rabbit hole. Should keto be a high fiber diet and meet the fiber recommendations? Or should it not? Is fiber in the case of a keto diet perhaps not as important? And that led me down the rabbit hole of contextual nutrition. Nutrition is contextual. What you need depends on what you're eating. It's not just that there is a blanket thing that we all need, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And in fact, I remember reading a paper, I can't recall when it was, maybe it was in 2016 or 2018, where there are very few papers actually investigating the impact of literally no fiber on the gut in humans. But there was this one paper, and you'll know it, I'm sure. And there was, and I believe, I can't recall whether
Was
it
this
was
the
a crossover study or
David's
not.
paper with the 10 patients, and half of them were put on an animal-based diet of less than 3 grams of fiber a day or carbs a day?
Yes,
And
that
the
was
others
the
were
one.
plant-based. Yes.
That was the one. Yes. And there was an uptick in bacteria, like the short chain fatty acid production, which, gave rise to the suggestion that actually there can be a shift in that microbiome, which is favorable on a no carb diet. There are very few papers like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's too few papers like that. And I think that's why we really need to start publishing more papers. But I can definitely recommend from a mechanistic perspective to look at Scholl, Mailing, and Wood's paper, which was published. I know it's a review paper, so it's, but it reviews a lot of really interesting stuff. Can't remember when it was published. I think it's relatively recent.
21 or 20 or something. Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. So they go through all the arguments for the problems or the benefits for the gut with a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet. And they also refer to that David's paper. And in the David's paper, they put, either people on an animal-based diet or a plant-based diet. The animal-based diet was less than 3 grams of carbs a day. The plant-based diet was plenty of carbs and fiber. And they found that the diversity of the bacteria didn't change with either diet either. It was just the types of bacteria. So people scientists think that alpha diversity, which is how diverse your bacteria are, that is a sign of good gut health. And so if we see a reduction in alpha diversity, we think gut health is getting worse. But there was no reduction in alpha diversity in that study. And like you said, they found that it was merely a change in the types of bacteria. So it was a change in the animal-based diet, it was a change to more in the plant-based diet, there was more short-chain producing bacteria. But in the animal-based diet, they found that there was more short-chain acids produced in other ways. And there were more of 2 other short-chain. So I think it's getting complicated. But can I break that down quickly for your listeners? Because I feel like we're in the weeds a little bit, and I just want to explain where we're going. Okay.
Yeah, do it.
Okay. So short-chain fatty acids are exactly what they sound like, right? They're fats that are short. Now you get long fats, you get medium fats, and you get short little fats. And these are short little fats. And interestingly, ketones, which comes from the ketogenic diet, they are short chain fats. So they are short chain fatty acids. Ketones are short chain fatty acids. Okay. One of them that we produce inside us, which is said to have a lot of the good benefits of the ketogenic diet, is called, there are 3, but one of them is called the beta hydroxybutyrate. Okay, BHB. But importantly is the word butyrate, because fiber's purported benefits are from being converted or broken down by bacteria into a short-chain fatty acid called butyrate. Okay, so we make butyrate on the inside when we have a ketogenic diet, and that butyrate is called beta hydroxybutyrate. But our microbes in our gut can convert fiber into butyrate as well. So there's 2 ways you can get butyrate. One is through the gut fermentation, and one is through your blood by eating a low-carb diet. So importantly, the benefits of fiber are thought to be mainly from butyrate. But when you're on a ketogenic diet, you might not be getting as much fiber, especially if you're doing a ketovore or carnivore diet. But your body is going to be making plenty of butyrate from the inside, which can access the cells, the gut lining cells as well. So the gut lining can be accessed through blood from the inside, or it can be accessed through the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract, so where your food sits. And the epithelial cells of your gut need butyrate. They eat butyrate. That's their fuel. So if you don't have enough butyrate for your epithelial cells, they're going to start to malfunction, shrink up, and you're going to get gaps in those tight junctions that we spoke about earlier as well, which is going to cause the gut to let things through that it shouldn't let through. But you can feed your gut either from the inside through a ketogenic diet and short-chain fatty acids that way, or from the lumen. Also, interestingly, when you eat a ketogenic diet that's low in fiber, you're not going to be making much butyrate from the inside of the lumen, but you will make butyrate alternatives that do the same thing as butyrate. These are called isobutyrate and acylcarnitine, as well as isovalerate, I think. But basically, these are produced from protein and bile, respectively, and they go into the same pathway and feed the cells in exactly the same way as butyrate does. In fact, they might even be more potent. So in other words, you can feed your gut cells and make a healthy gut by eating fiber, which gets fermented into the short-chain fatty acids, or you can eat a low-fiber diet, a ketogenic diet, that produces just as much short-chain fatty acids to feed the cells, but it does it in a different way.
And is that your... I have a question later on, which I know that we won't get to any of those questions today, as we talked about, which is fun because we're actually covering a lot of them when we're just talking about your story. But is that the metabolic flexibility of the gut, Tamzyn, like the ability to produce butyrate through a number of different pathways and maybe other bacteria as well, and depending on that gut environment and what's being fed in?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is what Scholl, Wood, and Mailing's paper proposes or hypothesizes, that a healthy gut is a metabolically flexible gut. So if you feed it a ketogenic diet with lots of veggies, which I just want to say isn't bad for everyone. A lot of people can tolerate lots of veggies. And I wouldn't say that everyone has to, if you're not having problems eating a keto diet with plenty of salads and stir fries and whatever, then I'm not saying that everyone has to do it the way I do it. I think there's space for individual variation. But if you choose to eat that way, then you're going to have a change. You'll have the same alpha diversity, same biodiversity in your gut, but you're going to have different, in South Africa, we call them hogs. You're going to have different bugs in your gut for what you're exposing them to. And that's appropriate. Your gut is adapting to what you're putting in. If you eat a more carnivore diet, then it would be inappropriate for your gut to continue maintaining all the bacteria that produce the butyrate from the fiber because you're not giving it fiber. Why would it do that? It will rather, change the bacteria so that it's more appropriate to what is being fed. And that would be what you're describing, Mikki, a metabolically flexible gut. And I just want to say, I do think that people with gut problems, such as myself, have reduced metabolic flexibility. A bit like someone with diabetes has reduced, as Prof. Noakes says, carbohydrate tolerance. They're no longer tolerant to carbohydrates. A lot of people, like athletes, for example, can handle more carbs and be fine. They might be able to have more fruit and some honey, like Saladino, and, more dairy. And for them, considering their metabolic health and their genetic propensities and their activity level, they can handle more carbs. So for them, it might not be a problem. But if you put a diabetic on the same amount of carbs, you're asking for trouble because it might still be an unprocessed, really good whole food diet, but they are already, and I hate to say this, but metabolically broken. They are already at a point where their body isn't processing carbohydrates properly anymore. And in order to treat that, they need to go very low carb. Now, if your gut is broken, like I consider my gut is broken, I can achieve remission, just like a diabetic can achieve remission on a low carb keto diet. And people with inflammatory bowel disease, as was also shown with, Nick Norwitz, he's a ulcerative colitis patient who's recently published with Sotomotor a study on a case series on inflammatory bowel disease, people who improve substantially on a carnivore keto diet. So you can achieve remission, but if you go back to eating how you were eating, are you cured? So is it a reversal? Is it a remission? And I believe it's a remission. And I believe that because your gut is so-called broken, you might not be able to tolerate things that people who are the Saladinos of the world can tolerate, or maybe you, Mikki, maybe you can tolerate a more diverse diet than I can because my gut is already so-called broken. And so I have
I think this is the reason why having, like, when people talk about, like, is this healthy for me? Is this healthy? Is this, like, you cannot answer that question without context, because you're right. Like, my big salad for lunch is healthy for me, but it's going to cause your gut, it's going to rip your gut to shreds. So it's certainly not a healthy option for you. Totally.
Yeah, exactly. And that shows again the importance of the contextual nature of diet. It's contextual in who you're dealing with and where they are sitting metabolically and health-wise. But also, eating different diets makes your body need and react differently to certain things. So, for example, someone on a ketogenic diet, they downregulate their proteins and enzymes and receptors that are required to process carbohydrates. So if you give someone an oral glucose tolerance test who is fat adapted and low carb or keto, they're going to fail. They're going to look diabetic because their body has realized it's not getting carbs. So why should it continue to produce all these proteins and everything else to process carbs? They're superfluous. It would be a waste on the body's resources. So it downregulates basically the carb processing factory equipment. It downregulates it. We don't need this. We're throwing out the carb, or we're putting it in storage, the carb factory equipment, and we're taking out the fat factory equipment that processes fats and ketones rather, because we're getting more of that. And that is adaptive. That is appropriate. It's metabolically flexible. But within 3 days of feeding an adaptive carb resistance, or in other words, you feed a fat adapted person or a keto person carbs again, they will be able to process it again. But if you feed them carbs on the day that they're fat adapted, they've been eating this way for 2 years, their carb factory is in remission or in hibernation, they're going to have a blood glucose spike because their equipment isn't there at the moment. And so contextually, they are insulin resistant or carb intolerant, but it's an adaptive, appropriate physiological response.
Yeah, and Tamzyn, for you, so you sort of went, okay, I'm going to see if I can push this a little further to help resolve more of my gut issues. And you said, was it a gradual approach to removing all vegetables? Like, how did that look for you? And you also mentioned, which I would really love for you to just chat briefly about, is that things seem to get worse before they get better. And so I'd love you to sort of talk us through that, because I see this a lot with diet, and I think it's really helpful for people to understand that it's almost a normal sort of part of the process sometimes. So can you chat about those things?
So I started to remove certain carbs or certain vegetables that I felt were irritating my gut and causing bloating. And in that way, I kind of removed the more fibrous ones. I started cutting down on the broccoli and the cauliflower and found that helped. I started cutting down on, obviously, the cabbage and those kind of stir fry kind of things because I found that helped. But then the carnivore thing started emerging, and I had a friend who was doing incredibly well on it, a patient and a friend actually, who was doing incredibly well on it. And so I thought, well, you know what? Let me try and see, because I can't start putting patients onto this who are coming to me for a carnivore diet unless I've self-experimented as well. So that was a dramatic thing. I cut all plant foods apart from coffee, which I had one cup a day. So I removed all plant foods, and I found that all of my gas and bloating went away. My tummy was flat for the first time in a long time, and my constipation also went away. But then I removed the dairy as well. And when I did that and did a carnivore diet without dairy, I found that within 3 days, I ended up with terrible diarrhea. And so much so, and they said, oh, well, I saw on all the forums and everyone who was doing carnivore, they say, well, this often happens. You just stick with it and your gut flora will normalize and the diarrhea will go away. That didn't happen. 3 weeks, I was still unable to leave the house. And I thought, well, I can't maintain this. I've got a life to live and I've got school runs to do. I've got work meetings to go to. I can't not be able to leave the house because of this for 3 weeks. Otherwise, I felt great. And so I reintroduced fermented dairy. And I found that well, actually, first I reintroduced a bit of avo as well, and maybe a little bit of berries. And I found that the diarrhea abated. So I could do a carnivore diet, but a carnivore diet with fermented dairy and squash as well. I had squash and I had avo and I had berries and I had a little bit of honey and I had the yogurt or the kefir. And I found that then I could be carnivore-ish. And eventually, after process of elimination, I found that the key ingredient in that was either I had to have enough fiber, so I had to reintroduce plant foods to a certain level, or I had to have fermented dairy, one or the other. And if I had one or the other of those, I didn't have those terrible gastrointestinal side effects that lasted for 3 weeks and longer, I imagine, but I was never willing to try it for longer than that. And so for me, and I've noticed I've had patients since then also with bowel conditions. And for them, the same thing seems to work. Where if they add in kefir or yogurt, and I'm talking about plain yogurt, ideally raw, fermented, kind of ideally A2 dairy if you can get it. Yeah. But even regular, Greek yogurt from the shops seems to work. Or a double cream plain yogurt seems to work. And since then, I've actually thought, well, perhaps it's to do with an overgrowth of hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria in people with gut problems. And hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria, when they are fed a high meat fat diet, they actually produce more of themselves, and you end up getting very high levels of hydrogen sulfide, which is associated with all the side effects that I was experiencing and that some of my patients with pre-existing gut conditions experienced, including diarrhea. But also it can be gut hypersensitivity, worsening of IBS symptoms, worsening of inflammatory bowel disease symptoms, and even an overabundance of hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria has been associated with colorectal cancer. So you don't want too much of that. But all you have to do to reduce it is to either add in a certain amount of plant foods that you can tolerate to reduce those hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria, or from anecdotal experience would be to add in fermented dairy. And that seems to resolve it. And you can still get all the benefits of a carnivore diet.
So I really want to know what you eat on a day-by-day basis. And also, yes. Obviously, we met in San Diego at the Low Carb USA Metabolic Health Symposium. And so outside of your usual environment, you have to almost make do with what's available. And I'm interested to know how your gut responds now after this amount of time that you've had in the Ketovore diet. So those are two questions. So can we start with the first one? So what do you eat on a day-by-day basis?
Okay, Tamzyn? So I eat pretty... I eat the same thing every day almost. At
Most
least
of
for
us
breakfast.
Do, really. Yeah.
So breakfast is my big meal. I know a lot of people in our space, they only eat at midday and then they eat in the evening. I change that around. I eat in the morning and I eat in the mid-afternoon. So those are my two meals. For me, I like to do it early. It suits my family's schedule, and that works for me. And that's also something I want to just bear in mind, tell everyone, is that everyone thinks, oh, you have to skip breakfast and fast until midday. If that isn't how you work, that's okay. You still want to ideally be doing intermittent fasting to a certain degree, ideally at least 16 to 18 hours of not eating every 24 hours. But that comes naturally in most cases when you eat this way. And it doesn't have to be any particular time of day per se. In fact, there's some argument to be said that shifting your window early in the day might even be beneficial. But I think everyone's different again. And every family is different and every schedule is different. So for me, I will eat about 250 grams of minced beef, the highest fat content I can get. Often I can't get it at very high fat content where I live, in which case I make bone broth, and I find a lot of fat is rendered off the bone broth that I make. And I add the fat back in that way to my ground beef or my mincemeat. And so I have 250 grams of that. I have 2 eggs, and I have chicken liver pate, which I make and freeze as well. And the ground beef is made, like I said, with rendered animal fat as well as bone broth in the cooking of that. And then I have plenty of salt. And then if I don't eat my yogurt or my kefir, I'll be in trouble with my gut.
Yeah.
So I will straight after that, and I can't even wait half an hour. Otherwise, I'm in trouble. So within 30 minutes of eating that, I will have my half a cup to a cup of double cream or Greek yogurt, and I will have half a teaspoon of honey, raw honey with that as well. So I'm not low carb per se, but that's still, if you add it up, it's probably, it's no more than 15 grams of carbs in that meal.
Yeah.
Then if I get snackish in mid-morning, whatever, I will have a cup of bone broth and maybe some dried beef like biltong or a piece of cheese or something with butter on it. And then I eat again at around 2 p.m. maybe, 3 p.m. maybe, no, 2 p.m. And then it will be something like barbecued meat or an omelet with trout and cream cheese in it or something like that. But it'll generally be smaller. So it'll be maybe 2 eggs and some cheese kind of omelet, or a little bit, it will be a slightly smaller portion than for breakfast. And then depending on how my tummy feels, I'll decide whether my tummy feels like it needs yogurt again or not. Which is interesting. It depends on what I've eaten. So if it's like, let's say, lamb chops with a lot of fat, I will need to eat yogurt straight after that again, because otherwise I'll end up with problems. So then I'll have half a cup of yogurt with a quarter of some honey, raw honey dribbled over it, and then I'm done. I will have coffee with cream when I wake up as well. Sometimes with cream, sometimes black. It depends. So I didn't mention that. I will also have 1 cup of Earl Grey tea during the day. If I have more Earl Grey tea than that, I end up with often feeling slightly nauseous in the evening, especially if I have like a regular tea or like a Ceylon tea or an Earl Grey tea in the evening. And that's something I also want to mention. When you've got gut issues and you fast, you can sometimes get kind of this nausea feeling. And that I've also found not just with me, but with other patients and people around me who eat this way and who eat early in the morning. And if that happens in the evening, it often happens when you have a little snack in the evening. It's almost suddenly you feel nauseous. Or sometimes it can happen when you haven't eaten anything, in which case I'll have some biltong or dried beef and maybe some bone broth, and that generally helps and cures it for me. So my snacks would be that, biltong and bone broth, but my meals are that's how my meals look, and that's how I eat.
Yeah. And Tamzyn, obviously, as a woman, we are always told, like there is a lot of information out there that if you're a keto as a woman, your thyroid function reduces. There's nothing, as I understand, in literature to actually support that, but anecdotally we hear this. You'll have hormone disruption, and people blame that solely on the carbohydrate content being so low. So if you don't mind sharing, for you personally, but also in your understanding of the literature and with your client base, like what kind of problems, if any, have you seen with this? Because I think your experience, I think there are many people who may want to try an approach like yours, but have heard a lot of this other information that sort of stopped them from exploring it because they're afraid of these potential side effects.
So I think that's a very good question. So firstly, with the thyroid thing, there is evidence that thyroid hormone T3 reduces when you go on a low-carb diet. So that is true. But the evidence doesn't support that there's clinical signs of low thyroid or hypothyroidism in that context. So I think that's really important, because what that indicates is that even sometimes you find people with low thyroid whose thyroid hormone remains low, they actually get better on a keto diet. Their thyroid symptoms get better on a keto diet. And that seems to be because of improved thyroid hormone sensitivity. So in other words, you don't need as much thyroid hormone to have the end organ effects, because the tissues are more sensitive to thyroid hormone. You can get away with less and not end up with the clinical signs of hypothyroidism. So I'm definitely an advocate for that theory, because I'm definitely not seeing, if anything, I'm seeing improvement in hypothyroid symptoms in my patients. And in the literature also, it seems to agree with that. There is no sign of clinical hypothyroidism symptoms in people who go on a keto diet. Then when it comes to carbohydrates in women's cycles, so So this is an interesting one, and I am not 100% sure, but I definitely know that from anecdotal reports, women say that just before their menstruation, or the days or the week leading up to the menstruation, they often get cravings, especially for higher carb foods. And I feel that, well, and also anecdotally, again, I can't cite the literature on this, but I do find that if you give yourself a few more carbs, you often feel better and the craving goes away. And I do believe in a low carb keto diet for humans. I think that that's a more evolutionarily appropriate diet, natural human diet. But I also believe that our body's trying to tell us things. So if your body is telling you need more carbs, then what I do is I eat more carbs.
Yeah.
I might have an extra portion of double cream yogurt with a bit of honey, or I might go and eat a date and then feel fine. Or I might have a couple of strawberries and then feel fine. So I think you're not going to, as long as you don't go and tuck into the ice cream, then you don't choose highly processed foods to satiate that craving. But if it is, if you're noticing that it's not an addictive thing, so some people will have cravings and it's a sign of an addictive eating. But if it's rather something that comes on, a week before menstruation, then your body, I think, is trying to tell you something. And I say follow it as long as you're choosing healthy, whole food, real food, unprocessed way of doing that. And we know that there is a change in insulin sensitivity during the different phases of the menstrual or the women's cycle. We know that there's reduced insulin sensitivity during half of the cycle and increased insulin sensitivity during the other half of the cycle. And I think that's your body trying to prepare you potentially for, growing a baby. And while your body might not end up growing that baby, it's still trying to prepare for it, and it's doing things to prepare for it. And you fighting it, I don't know if that's really helpful. So now this isn't based on science, but I say if you're having the craving, have a couple of strawberries and some double cream yogurt or some, something like that.
Yeah.
And it seems to help.
Yeah. And what about the argument for carbohydrate too? Because and you, look, if you don't know, no problem at all, but I'm curious if any clients have had issues with actually like hypothalamic amenorrhea or like a loss of a menstrual cycle because of a keto diet or a carnivore diet.
No, I haven't seen that at all. Look, some people seem to undereat when they go on keto, but anecdotally, I'm seeing that more in men. I don't know why, but I'm not seeing it so much in women. Men often end up, and some women maybe too, but the people who I've seen undereat in practice when they go on a carnivore diet are men. And then they do need to, if you're under eating, you'll see it, if you're a man, for example, in your bloods, with higher testosterone and changes in your sex hormone binding globulin, things like that. Go to someone who knows how to look at your bloods and figure that out. But you can also see if you're having reduced energy. Hair loss is something else you look out for. But I only find that the like amenorrhea, for example, losing your period, happens when there's over-exercising and intentional undereating. And I've seen that. I've seen that in clients who have gone on to carnivore and they're still scared of saturated fat, so they don't want to eat fat. But now they're not eating carbs either. So they're eating lean protein. There's only so much lean protein you can have without it becoming toxic to you. So you either eat too much and start feeling sick, or you just stop eating protein at a certain level, and then you're basically under-eating and not giving your body all the calories it needs. So now you're under-eating, and then you push yourself and over-exercise. Then it's the same as the female athlete triad that we see in people who under-eat and over-exercise on any diet, Yeah. So I don't think, in my experience, I haven't seen it anymore on a carnivore population with women, provided they don't over-exercise and intentionally under-eat.
Yeah, and in my experience, it does appear to be more a function of low calories, which is conflated for low carbohydrate. And this is often the conversation that I have with my colleagues in the space as well. It's like, well, yes, they are low carb, but actually they're also massively low calorie too. So if you correct for calories, and like your eating approach has, in the way that you describe your diet, it's filled with micronutrients, it's filled with fats and proteins, providing sufficient calories, and that's the aim of it. And of course, now you can absorb and digest those calories because your gut isn't ripped to shreds. And I think that's a really important piece of it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, have you found people going onto a carnivore lifestyle, Mikki, have you found amenorrhea? Are you finding that they're having menstrual irregularities when they go on, women who go onto a carnivore diet?
Tamzyn, in the small number of women that I've spoken to, because it is small, who already have adopted this lifestyle, they've done it because they've been forced to it from a health perspective, and things resolve, but what I do know is that there is hesitation if I suggest it to people here, at least in the cohort that I work with. They're somewhat hesitant. Like for them, that would be quite a restricted approach for them, and they're not willing really to do it, if I'm honest, because it feels extreme to them.
So I think for people with gut issues, I think this can be life-saving and life-altering, for your quality of life. And in people with autoimmune conditions, that's the other group that I would say, if you go carnivore, and then if you work with a qualified and knowledgeable nutritionist or dietitian who can help you reintroduce certain foods to the point where you have the best quality of life, because you can eat, like, for example, I can eat squashes. So I can eat like a gem squash or any other kind of squash, and I know I'll be okay. I can eat lettuce and I'll actually be okay. I can eat a bit of cucumber and I'll also be okay. So I've identified I can eat berries, especially strawberries, but maybe not the blueberries with the skin too much. Then I know what point I'll be okay. If I have more than 1 cup of coffee, I'm not going to be okay. I know that if I drink wine, in my case, if I have more than 2 or 3 sips, I'm not going to be okay. So it's about identifying your individual trigger points, using a carnivore diet as an elimination diet, and then being carefully guided to introduce more and more foods up to your individual tolerance level. That's what I believe in. And I think it works incredibly well for gut disorders and for autoimmune conditions.
Yeah. And I agree with you. And I guess the other reason why I haven't had a lot of clients on a carnivore diet is that my typical population are athletes or are fat loss clients, and they're not more complex gut-related issues, which I think that's where a carnivore is really well suited to. So
absolutely.
Yeah. And then
I think the clients that you see, Mikki, like I'm sure that they generally, keto will be fine for them, where they can have salads and they can have an odd glass of wine and that kind of thing. And I think that's, again, I think what we're emphasizing a lot here and people need to take home is the bio-individuality that exists in different people. Depends how broken you are in what sort of areas, which is individual, or what your genetic propensities are, or, those kind of things. And even the case like back to the the dietary contextual nature of diet. I mean, if you see that someone who eats a keto diet may not need to eat fiber, because they're getting butyrate in a different way. And so it shows that, yes, fiber may still be very, 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 and probably is very important for someone not on a keto diet, because they're not getting butyrate any other way. Similarly, you look at things like vitamin C, and I think Amber Hearn covers this so beautifully in one of her lectures, which you can find on YouTube, about the RDAs on a carnivore diet. But, she points out that people who eat just steaks or eat like the whole animal, eat a carnivore diet, they're not ending up with scurvy. They're not ending up with vitamin C deficiency. Why? They should be, from the amount of vitamin C that they're eating. And, the theory is, well, they don't need as much vitamin C because they're eating collagen. And one of the main reasons you eat vitamin C is for the production of collagen. But you only have to produce a lot of collagen if you aren't eating a lot of collagen. And if you're eating a carnivore diet, you're eating a lot of collagen. And you can think of that. I mean, that makes sense, because when you think of scurvy and you think of the salty sea dogs and the pirates who had teeth falling out and holes in their skin, that's because their collagen, their connective tissue is degrading, right? That's what vitamin C deficiency looks like. But if you're eating it in a preformed manner, you probably don't need it as much. Similarly, I mean, if you're eating a lot of omega-6 fats, you might need a lot more omega-3 fats, because the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is important, for health. Whereas if you're eating almost no omega-6 fats, you probably can get away with a little bit less omega-3. So again, there's this contextual nature to nutrition where RDAs aren't the same for everyone, actually. And we need to redefine what is nutritional sufficiency within different dietary contexts.
Yeah. I love that, Tamzyn, and that is a perfect way, I think, to round out our conversation. Literally, I could actually talk to you for hours about this, but I think that that's such a good point for everyone to consider. So the whole idea of what is healthy and what isn't healthy, it's not even a question that can be answered without the background knowledge and the context. Tamzyn, can you please tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and your work, because I know that you also have been an editor for this amazing ketogenic sort of textbook, plus also you're a co-author on some books, and where they can find out more from you and Nutrition Network.
Absolutely. So you can go to our website, www.nutritionnetwork.org, and that's where you can find out more about the work that I do, find out more about the ketogenic textbook. I'm a lecturer for Nutrition Network as well. So that's where you can find us. We also are on Twitter. We're also on Facebook. And you can find me on all of those platforms as well, although I'm not very active. But you can speak to me directly if you search for Tamzyn Murphy. Tamzyn with a Z or Z-Y.
Yes.
And then you can also search for Tamzyn Murphy RD, and you should be able to find me. But you can also find me directly through Nutrition Network and all the work that we do there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tamzyn, and I will include those links in the show notes, in addition to the gut-related papers that we were referring to. Thanks so much, Tamzyn.
Thanks,
you
Mikki.
have a great rest of your day.
What a privilege to speak to you and your listeners. Thank you for having me.
All right, team, hope you really enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. She's such a wealth of information, and it was a really a great opportunity to chat to her. Now, on the same theme, next week on the podcast, I speak to Dr. Anthony Chaffee about his carnivore diet. He's currently based in Perth, Western Australia, but from his professional background as a doctor and training neurologist. Until then, though, you can catch me over on Instagram, Threads and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, or head to my website mikkiwilliden.com, where, if you're catching this when it drops on Wednesday, you've still got a couple of days left to sign up to Monday's Matter September edition. In addition to the usual Monday's Matter plans, I also have a 4-week Keep It Simple plan that tries to meet people a little bit more where they're at with regards to changing their nutrition habits. And also, for the first time, I have a 4-week vegetarian plan, which is aimed to be repeated. And these both come, of course, with shopping lists also. So that is for the remainder of this week. Monday's Matter is on sale because we kick off Monday, 30th of September. All right, team, you have the best week. Talk to you soon. Bye.